general degree of smugness is required at the beginning of this video. Have I finished reorganising my library? Yeah. Can I bring myself to look at the footage of me doing so while sweating, crying and lying on the floor questioning my life choices? Not so much. Do I now have a book and eventually plant trolley? Yes. Do I also have an entire wall of UNHAUL books? Yes. Okay, so maybe what we're going for is a general degree of smugness peppered by infinite regret. And the ever-present question of why am I like this? Hi guys, it's Leanne and I am here today to do a video that I have never done before on this channel. Today we are here to talk about books that I have absolutely loved but will never read again. And in fact, for the most part, I'm unhauling from my library. That's right, this little stack here, they're all going. Usually when I get rid of something from my library, it's because I am saltily not recommending that you read it. I am usually in some way saying, this book was less than perfect, therefore it cannot live in my home. I mean, there are other less than perfect things that live in my home, but all of them are dogs. Because the cats are perfect and you may not question that. Oh yeah, and I forgot lovely wife Helen. She's kind of perfect too. Yeah. Shan't discuss me. Let's move along. Let's start with two books from the same author. We have got here The Little Stranger and Affinity, both by Sarah Waters. I'm sure I don't need to introduce Sarah Waters to you guys, but in case you have never heard of her, she writes exclusively queer historical fiction. And I have previously unhauled every book that I have ever read from Sarah Waters. Sarah Waters in general for me plays a little bit too much into the tragic gay love story camp, where moments of joy are like really hard earned but also very fleeting. And so even if the end ends on sort of like a questionably smiley note, the rest of the book has pretty much ripped out your soul and convinced you that if you're on the LGBTQIA+++ list anywhere, that you can never just be happy without having to earn it in some way. It's even more interesting because I think that that principle is actually fairly true of Affinity, which is the first book that I'm going to recommend to you guys and then promptly get rid of. I read this one so many years ago. It was published in 1999 and I can't even tell you the year in which I actually read it because I don't remember. But I remember picking it up and it being one of the first examples of there being clearly queer characters on the page, and I was absolutely captivated by it. So there's a chance that a little bit of my nostalgia for this novel lies in that. But mostly, this is by far the shortest of all of Sarah Waters' novels, and I honestly deeply believe that if her editors were harsher with her, all of her novels would end up being this size and all of them would end up being exactly this page turning. This one is set in the Victorian period and this follows Margaret Pryor, who is an upper middle class woman who has fallen on some strange times in society. She has a couple of blots in her copybook because she has some mental health problems and she has previously tried to commit suicide. To avoid ending up in an asylum, Margaret has had to pretend that she is completely fine now and she doesn't suffer from any of those problems anymore, and she has volunteered to become a person who goes into a women's prison, into Millbank prison, which still kind of gives me shivers when I say its name, to like spread the good word and Christianity and uplift these women from their like lowly ends. But when Margaret gets to the prison, she discovers that the women there are nothing like what she expected them to be. They are not all criminals or they are not all insane. Actually, some of them are perfectly personable and very nice. It's just that a lot of them have fallen on hard times or are involved in the sex trade or are like the person she gets absolutely obsessed with, a spiritualist. Margaret gets involved with a prisoner called Selena Dawes, who is both young and fairly attractive and very respectable, but is definitely somebody who believes that she can speak to ghosts and the dead. Of course, seances and Ouija boards and communicating with the other side was a massive fascination at this time. And Margaret, having absolutely no context to any of this and having never been involved in any of it before, is just completely fascinated, and she starts trying to find a way to get Selena out. As with all of Sarah Waters' books, there is a massive twist at the end, but unlike some of her other books where I've just been like, well, that happened, this one is just It's one of those twists where you get to the end and it's so like that you want to start again immediately and read the whole thing with this new context that you have gained. As I've said, I am a serial rereader and I will read and read and read my favourites over and over again, and I have absolutely no shame about that. This is actually my second copy of this book, I'm fairly sure, because the first one fell to bits. But when I pass it on the shelves these days, I look at it with fondness, but I don't look at it with an air of, I'm probably going to pick you up again. And I just don't have space on my shelves to keep books that I know that I'm probably never going to reread. The second book was, of course, The Little Stranger, and this one, I am going to admit, it pains me a lot more to get rid of. But it is a massive book, and once again, I don't know when or if I'm ever going to reread it. The Little Stranger is set in the years after World War I, when a lot of large family estates, think Downton Abbey, have kind of gone to rack and ruin because they have not been able to adapt to suit the times. 100 Acres Hall stands in the middle of the Warwickshire countryside, and it is beautiful, but it is in serious decay. The family inside, who are now a brother who was severely injured in the war, a sister and an elderly mother, are literally tacking up pieces of wallpaper that are peeling off the walls, putting buckets under things. Generally the place is falling down around their ears, and then one day their maid, the one and only maid that they have, falls ill because she says that she could hear horrible things coming from the nursery. Nursery hasn't been used for many years, and so the family are forced to call a very expensive local doctor who comes in, and during his evaluation of this maid becomes kind of friendly with the family. As Dr. Faraday gets more and more involved with the Ayres family, more and more strange things start to happen. This is very much a ghost story, it's very much a haunted house story, but it's also a story of how people using coercive control and persuasion can get under the skin of the people around them completely unnoticed and in a way that just makes my entire skin still crawl. This is an amazing book. As soon as this came out, I picked it up immediately. I got it on release day and I read it cover to cover, and I was just enchanted by it. It was amazing. I remember at the time being really annoyed at the ending of this one though, because it gives no conclusions, it's very open-ended. There are a few red herrings right up until the last page, and then you kind of have to decide what you think about the book. But again, the reason that I'm giving this up after singing its praises so much is because I don't ever see myself reading it again. The next one that I'm going to be parting with is actually going to a friend of mine who's very interested in it, which makes me really happy because this particular proof has been in so many people's hands since I got it. Yep, I still have my proof version of this, and that is Nina Is Not Okay by Shappi Khorsandi. The real cover of it looks like this. When I looked up the synopsis of this to just remind myself of some of the details, I discovered that it was actually marked as a young adult book, and that's a choice. Let me explain the plot and it'll make more sense. This one is about Nina, and Nina thinks that she's doing perfectly fine in life. She has just started at college, she's 17, and she knows she has a drinking problem, but what other 17-year-old doesn't have a drinking problem, in her opinion? She frequently wakes up in weird places after blacking out and not knowing how she gets there. She doesn't find it odd that she has lots of texts that are really horrible that she has both sent and received on her phone. She doesn't really find it that strange that every day she's passing a friend who won't talk to her anymore, because she just assumes that she did something when she was drunk, and really she thinks that all of the things that she does when she's drunk are just going to be college legend when she leaves. And then one night a picture is taken of Nina doing something which is very not okay, and that picture literally brings down her entire life. This is definitely a book that is an exploration of mental health. Reading this book was so difficult. I struggled so much with it because Nina is totally vulnerable through the entire book. There are so many really horrible situations in this book where terrible things could have happened to her, and she has narrow escapes. And the thing that made it so horrifying is that Shappi Khorsandi's writing made them so real. She writes dialogue and characters so snappily that I could easily see these being conversations that I was overhearing between real people. In fact, if you'd have told me that this was a memoir that was written as fiction, I would have no problem believing in that, because I was so deeply invested in these characters. And what happens after it is not this like miraculous transformation where her whole life is magically solved. She hits rock bottom and she's like, oh, well, better get back on the wagon and fix everything. She has some ups and downs afterwards that you follow, and I was really satisfied by the place she got to at the end of this novel. Like, I was really proud of her, and I felt like that, like she was actually an 18-year-old in my life. I was like, I'm so proud of you. You've made so much progress. But I don't want to read about it again. I just even talking about this novel right now, I'm like, oh, but I love her so much. I don't want to get rid of it. But my policy is that I don't keep things on my shelves that I'm not going to reread again, because I don't have infinite space. And I don't ever think I'm going back there, because it made me so sad. On a slightly lighter note, here is an urban fantasy novel which the first time I read it, I absolutely adored it, and I've never been able to make it through a second or a third or a fourth or however many times I have tried it again. This is Nightshifted by Cassie Alexander, and it's honestly really great. I remember having such a positive experience when I read this the first time around. And for an urban fantasy, it's a really different kind of plot. This is about Edie Spence, and she is a nurse at a normal community hospital, and then one day she is offered a job on a locked ward. She knows that what happens on ward Y4 is like top secret and potentially has something to do with government research, and so she hasn't ever been really that interested in it before, but she desperately needs the extra paycheck. But when Edie starts working on Y4, she realises that this is not actually a government experiment at all. This is a supernatural wing. There are vampires, there are shapeshifters, there are questionable things that it would give away some of the plot to tell you about. It's really interesting because in urban fantasy, a lot of the times people get hurt, right? It's part of the genre. There are a lot of battle scenes, there are a lot of, you know, werewolves battles and that kind of stuff. But I feel like you usually see the healing from the point of a romantic relationship. So it's usually like the hero or the heroine gets hurt and they're like tending each other, and that's part of the tropes of the genre. But there's rarely any explanation or emphasis on how they tend those creatures back to health, and that's definitely something that happens in Nightshifted. One day when Edie is treating a vampire who is not looking very good, he gives her essentially a last confession. He asks her to go somewhere and tell somebody something, and then he turns into dust, literally in her hands and on her uniform. And Edie finds that she can't not grant somebody their last request, so that's how the quest in this urban fantasy novel happens. But there's so much depth in this particular book. Edie's brother has struggled with drugs for his entire life, and he has reappeared and she's being forced to take him back in. But she doesn't totally trust him, and she's worked really hard for the things that she has because she doesn't have a lot of money, and she's worried that he's going to steal from her. All of that is going on in the background, and then there is of course a couple of layers of romance, which happens in most urban fantasy novels. But this was great. It was a wild ride and I really loved it, and this is actually the copy of it that I repurchased when my original one got trashed. I don't really know what happened to it, but I feel like I took it on holiday when I read it. The nostalgia of leaving my house. And I picked up this book with the exact intention to reread it and then pick up the rest of the series. But I don't know, I've never managed to get through it again. I've always started it and been like, oh, this is nice, and then it, you know, goes on a pile while I read other books. Let's return to books that have absolutely mangled my soul. This next one came out in 2013. I literally ran out of the door to a bookshop to go and purchase it on its release date. I read it cover to cover. It completely destroyed me, and now the very thought of this book triggers me so much that I know that I will never ever reread it. But that being said, it's one of the best books that I've ever read. Definitely very complicated up in here. That book is of course Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. So this book fictionalises the true story of Agnes Magnusdóttir, who in 1829 was the last woman ever to be executed in Iceland. So Agnes is accused of the brutal murder of her lover, and it happens in a very small, like, backwoods town in Iceland in the middle of nowhere, and she is taken from the courthouse to essentially a house that's forced to look after her until the trial has been had and her sentence has been passed down and they can execute her. And the story is then of Agnes's final months. We know right from the very beginning of this novel that because it's a true account, Agnes was actually executed, so you are following her through what are certainly the last days of her life. And you're following the impact that she has on the family that she stays with, because of course the story of Agnes is not just as simple as she killed somebody and therefore she's going to be executed for it. It's weird how much of a deep fondness I have for this novel because it is incredibly bleak. There are no happy points in this novel, it's that simple. The crux of this story and the real emotion in this story is people getting to know Agnes for who Agnes is. She never runs away, she's not violent, she doesn't attempt to do anything other than the chores that she's asked to do. And so they slowly get more and more comfortable with her to a point where they start asking her questions about her past and her story starts to pour out. But of course by then it's far, far too late. Agnes has been sentenced to death and they are just waiting for an executioner from the main cities to be able to get there. And once you know how Agnes got into these circumstances and once you know that everybody around her, not a single person judges her for what she's done, you then have to see her final scenes where she is taken from that house to the place where she is executed and the execution takes place, and it's awful. It's really awful. There are so many triggery things in this novel for me that I could never think about rereading it, but I cannot say that it was not one of the most amazing experiences that I ever had with a novel. Next up is a book that took literary fiction booktube by absolute storm when it came out. When I received this from the publisher, I dug into it straight away and I also was completely converted. So looking back on that book now, I'm like, yeah, I recommend that you read it. I absolutely loved it when I read it. But now when I look back on it, I'm just a little bit like, This is of course The Tidal Zone by Sarah Moss. This is essentially the story of Adam, which is a thing that we'll get to in a minute. And Adam is a stay-at-home dad and an architect. He is writing a history on the architecture in his area, specifically of a cathedral that is in his town. And one day he is at home doing the things that he does on a general day, and he receives a phone call to say that his teenage daughter is now in the back of an ambulance being taken to a local hospital because she randomly stopped breathing at school. And this is the story of how Adam and his children and his wife's lives are completely changed forever by the fact that this happened, because they were so certain of their entire lives, they were so certain of the pattern of their days, that when this happened, it's that moment where you think, is everything completely random? If this person could have just died for no reason on this day, like what am I doing with my life? Throughout the start of this book there's a lot of hospital content, and Adam frequently finds himself getting so frustrated because the doctors can't answer any of his questions. They don't know what caused this, and so he's trying to like pick up the pieces of his life and get on with his life again, but the meaning of it has shifted, which also results in a lot of discussions about being a stay-at-home dad and about the way that other people in his family look down at him for being a stay-at-home dad while his wife is the main breadwinner. It's very, very literary fiction, and the criticisms that I see levelled at this book are mainly that it's quite pretentious. Weirdly, I didn't find that. Usually I'm the first one to call that out in a literary fiction book. I actually really, really enjoyed this one. I raced through it again, which there's not a lot of plot in here. Most of the plot going on is purely Adam working through his feelings about what happens after this happens to his daughter. But an interesting thing has happened in my brain, in that when I look back at this, I remember being really, really attached to every character in this book who wasn't Adam. Adam really annoys me even to this day, like looking back at Adam and the things that he thinks about himself and his life and his family. It really annoys me. His point of view just irritates the crap out of me. I realised when I was looking at it on my shelf that I was never going to reread it because I don't want to spend that much time with Adam ever again. Next up is a book that pains me to get rid of because even now I love it so incredibly, desperately much, but it is another book that I cannot see myself ever rereading because it is so painful. That book is Bastard Out of Carolina by Dorothy Allison. This is set in South Carolina, I think, in the 1950s, and it follows Bone. Bone is a young girl. I think when we start following her, she is something like 6 years old, and this takes her up to her very early adulthood, and she lives in an extremely impoverished situation with a mother who is not entirely stable and in a family relationship that is less than ideal. Initially, when we're introduced to Bone, what we get is all of her sunny childhood stuff. She loves making iced tea with her grandma. She loves going and fishing for tadpoles with her cousins. She loves running about barefoot on the dry earth in front of her grandmother's house. She loves the way that she's growing up, and she doesn't see anything impoverished or lacking in her childhood whatsoever, and I think that is actually one of the most heartbreaking things. Her mum, who has always tried to put her first but who is very chaotic, ends up in a relationship with a man who has in fact been watching their family for a long time. It's really sinister the way that this relationship first starts to play out, because we completely see the way that her mother is being sucked into an unsafe situation, and yet there is nothing and no one around her that is able to help prop her up or make her see that this might not be ideal for her. This relationship is abusive and really cyclical, and we see again and again the way that Bone is put into peril and has to survive through some circumstances that she should never be exposed to, and that leaves her as a teenager and an older child with so many issues that could have been avoided. And where this novel eventually ends up, the conclusion to this novel, it's just so painful, and it's definitely the kind of conclusion that you would expect from this narrative. There's no happy endings, there's no rainbows, not everything gets wrapped up. There's not even really that much hope sprinkled in there for the future, and normally I would hate that in a novel. I would hate to like leave these characters that we've followed for this whole time and not have even a shred of an idea of a vague sense that they might one day be okay. But in this case, it was the only ending that was appropriate. It was the only thing that fit, and it was amazing, but it was so painful, so incredibly painful, and I don't want to get rid of this book because this story means so much to me, but at the same time, again, I'm never going to reread this. It was so hard to get through in places the first time around, even though I was in love with it. I just can't see me going back and doing it again. And finally, for books that I have absolutely loved, like really and truly loved, and I still look back on this one and I don't want to say fond feelings because it's a horrendous story. Again, there's definitely a theme in this video. But it's a book that I look back on and I think, oh, I really enjoyed reading that. I really, really enjoyed the mystery unfolding, and that is The Lovely Bones. The Lovely Bones is a thriller slash mystery which definitely has one foot in literary fiction, and it is told from the point of view of Susie Salmon. She tells you right at the beginning of the novel that she was 14 when she was murdered, and that she now looks down on her family from her version of heaven, and she is watching their grief play out. She's watching them find out that she's been murdered. She's watching them live afterwards, and she's watching them day after day after day encountering the person who murdered her living on the same street as her. This one was published in 2002, and I think it was definitely that year that I picked it up. It's weirdly yellowed over time. It's not that old compared to some of the other books that I have, but I guess that's maybe because I've read this one several times, so it's like been off my bookshelf and exposed to sunlight so many times that it's just like, nah, we give up. I remember the reason that I picked this up, and it was because this was in the very early days of the Richard and Judy book club. Does anybody remember that? Ooh, how problematic are Richard and Judy just on their own? Anyway, the quote on the front of this from the Times, which like, who Who out of any of the readers do I know actually pays any attention to what like the Times or the Daily Mail or the Evening Standard have to say about books? Can we just let newspapers die? I mean, like the Daily Mail, really? Anyway, the quote on the front of this one from the Times says that it's compulsive enough to read in a single sitting, and that is exactly what I did with it the first time that I read this through. There is a real strange, creepy factor in Susie's ability to watch her entire family, because at 14 she is watching things that she doesn't really have the emotional intelligence to understand, and so we are having to interpret what she sees from an adult's perspective and be like, oh, that is what's really going on. She watches her dad and her mum slowly disintegrate, as a lot of couples do in actuality after the death of a child, and she watches her sister just pinwheel, just spiral all on her own when nobody's really paying attention to her. It's like they've lost one child and therefore they've lost interest in both children. That was really, really painful, but also it was really compelling because I wanted to see what her sister was going to do, because her sister and her dad in some instances in this are really the ones who are pushing to find out what happened to Susie. I've read this one several times and I've watched the movie adaptation of it, which is actually really good. It's actually a pretty decent interpretation of it, although it doesn't go as far as I would like it to with Susie's like weird heaven that she's in. But the one thing that I really hate about this book, again and again and again, and every time I read it I get the exact same thing, is that the end is so weird. The end is so odd, it's a little bit problematic, and it's just, it was not needed in any way. There was no need for it to exist. The end is a little magical realism-y, more so I guess than the idea of Susie sitting on a cloud looking at her family, but it's definitely like it's stepped away from that premise and into the realms of actual magical realism, and it was too far for me at the time. And in fact I'm still a person who doesn't like a lot of magical realism in my literary fiction, so it does pain me a little to give this one away, because it's definitely one of the oldest books on my shelves. It's definitely one of the books that like makes me smile when I look at it, which is weird because it's a very not smiley subject matter, but I honestly don't think I'm ever going to reread this one again. So that's it. Those were all of the books that I have loved desperately, that I really enjoyed when I read them, but I'm never going to read them again, and I am unhauling them. They are leaving my house. Some of them are bound for friends that I know are absolutely going to love them, and some of them are bound for, I don't know, my library or the charity shop when, you know, Scotland opens up again. When Scotland opens up again. Maybe essentially what I've done is just an unhaul from the shelves to the floor of my library where they're going to live for the next 6 months. I really hope that's not the case and that my parents can come around and take them to charity for me, because otherwise I feel my resolve may crack and I may put some of them back on my shelves. So I'm very curious, guys. I want to know what one book you guys have on your shelves right now that you can look at and you can say, I absolutely love that, but I will never reread it. And as always, if you have read any of the books that I've talked about today, please let me know what you thought about them down in the comments section. And I'll be back with you very soon with a video of me reorganising this library, which I'm kind of trying to make very vague in the background here, like it's very unfocused. So if you want to see me do that, why not hit the subscribe button and maybe the bell icon, because then you'll know immediately when it drops in your feed. And if you could give this video a little like if you liked it, a little thumbs up, that will help me a lot. I will speak to you guys very soon. Bye! Also, the best thing about all of this is that I never ever have to shelve any of those books ever again. None of them.